Now, before we started playing around with this, it had been demonstrated that nitric oxide synthase is one of the central components for mobilization of stem cells from the bone marrow. Cytokines, one of the major ones is vascular endothelial growth factor. Liberated from a peripheral site, the wound, migrates to the bone marrow, interacts with receptors on bone marrow stromal cells, which then activate nitric oxide synthase, makes NO, nitrosylates an inactive protease, metalloproteinase 9, that then cleaves an inactive hormone, so-called c-KIT, which the modern name now is stem cell factor. Solubilized stem cell factor interacts with dormant, if you will, sleeping stem cells in the bone marrow. They now enter the cell cycle, mitose, and the daughter cells go out into the periphery and participate in things like wound healing. Because we'd already shown that hyperbaric oxygen activates nitric oxide synthase, we said, maybe hyperbaric oxygen will piggyback onto this normal biochemical pathway in mobilized stem cells. And it just turned out that we were right. So this was our first paper. So this is mouse now. Looking at, so what we're looking at here is a nitric oxide synthase specific electrode implanted into the bone marrow of a mouse. Looking at NO production, the gray area is pressurization. Here to 2.8 atmospheres, you can do the same thing with other pressures. 2.8 is maximum benefit. Elevation of NO production. You can take out the NO response if you treat the animal with a nitric oxide synthase antagonist. There's many of them. We used L-nitroarginine methylester as an internal control. So this is NO production. In the mouse, so there's many different ways of labeling stem cells. Rather than boring you with the details, we'll just say there's different markers. This is one set of markers we used in mouse. First message here, as in humans, everybody's got some number of circulating stem cells in their blood all the time, although very low levels. L-name treatment doesn't change that. Pressure without hyperoxia, using a hypoxic gas mixture at 2.8 atmospheres, there's no mobilization, so this is not a pressure effect. 100% oxygen at 1 atmosphere is an ineffective dose of drug. You don't change tissue PO2 in the bone marrow at 1 atmosphere, which this paper actually shows you that data. Hyperbaric oxygen 2 or 2.8 atmospheres for 2 hours, you double, 90 minutes this protocol was, you double the number of stem cells immediately after the exposure. If the animal's nitric oxide synthase is inhibited, you don't get that response. If you look the next day after a single hyperbaric treatment, there's that many more stem cells in the circulation. If you give an animal another hyperbaric treatment and then look the next day, there's that much more stem cells in the circulation, all taken out if you inhibit nitric oxide synthase, and you don't get any better than that if you give repetitive treatments. It stabilizes out, but it remains elevated, increased circulation. Now, if you're a human and not a mouse, maybe you're interested in this data. So this was looking at patients that were getting hyperbaric oxygen treatment for radiation injury in the periphery. Just drawing blood, the protocol was drawing blood before and after the 1st, the 10th, and the 20th hyperbaric treatment. And we see this progressive rise in circulating stem cells in human beings, maxing out at about 8 times normal, which is pretty much as good as you can get with any of the current chemotherapeutic agents for mobilizing stem cells. Now, so there's increased numbers of stem cells by hyperbaric oxygen, and it's a nitric oxide synthase mediated response. So again, this yin-yang thing, reactive oxygen species mobilize stem cells. A separate phenomenon. The same paper, what we found, we were very surprised with this. Here we're looking at clonal efficiency of the stem cells. So this was the last slide, a progressive rise of numbers of circulating stem cells. But if you do something other than just counting, simply counting the stem cells, if you put a bunch of them on a Petri plate and you say, how many clones grow up when you plate so many cells? If you plate 100,000 cells, about 12 clones happen before the first treatment. You get double the clonal efficiency immediately after the hyperbaric treatment. But if you look before the 10th treatment, it looks just like go. And the same thing after the 20th. We see this doubling of clonal efficiency in a sawtooth response, even though the numbers are increased. So there's something else going on with hyperbaric oxygen merely than more stem cells. And so we had to go back to the mouse to figure this stuff out. So our model was a bunch of mice, and there's a rather simple-minded notion. We inject subcutaneously this stuff called matrigel, which is a liquid. It's a liquid at 0 degrees, and it becomes a solid at body temperature, sort of the opposite of what you think about. And so it allows a relatively non-invasive, we can do this entirely sterilely. And the idea was if we're going to see stem cell mobilization, it would go from the bone marrow to the bloodstream to this entirely avascular structure, and then we could look at blood vessel production. And this is just a very crude picture of a piece of matrigel 5 days after implantation in a control mouse, or 5 days after implantation in a mouse that got daily hyperbaric oxygen, which is obviously bright red. If you look only 1 day after treatment, and what we're doing now is we want to look at stem cell migration into this avascular structure and also ask the question, are they functional blood vessels? So the way we do this is, so we put the animal to sleep, and then we inject via the heart 40 nanometer fluorescent red beads. So obviously the only way the red beads get to the matrigel if it's a functional blood vessel throughout the system. We then section these pieces of matrigel and put it under the confocal microscope. CD34 is our marker for stem cells. We see some vessels in the control mouse after hyperbaric oxygen all over the matrigel. We see these very dense capillary arcades. They're functional vessels based upon the Naura beads, and that's the overlap. And if you do a one-to-one comparison of fluorescence based on stem cells and beads, it's virtually exactly one-to-one. So this is absolutely, by definition, a picture of vasculogenesis, new blood vessels generated by stem cells. The study actually was more than just HBO. We were also looking at lactate responses, which is sort of another story. But lactate goes up in wounds as part of normal physiology. It goes, you can't stop it because it's a product of neutrophil metabolism. And elevated lactate is itself an oxidative stress, which again you say, how can that be? And that has to do with lactate metabolism markedly elevating NADH levels, and as a consequence you see this basically an oxidative stress response, which is synergized with HBO, and that's why you see these still further elevations of stem cell mobilization with lactate plus HBO. Now, to go into the details of all of this stuff, I will spare you. I don't have enough time to do it. It's a very long story, but this slide sort of summarizes why it is that separate from making more cells, why does hyperbaric oxygen improve the function of stem cells? And the message here for this yin-yang theme is it's an oxidative stress response that persists long after the short-term exposure to hyperbaric oxygen. What happens is in the matrigel here, in the stem cells, there's a marked elevation production transiently of reactive oxygen species. In these papers, we actually measured hydrogen peroxide. And then there's a response. The initial response has to do with an antioxidant called thyroidoxin. Everyone's heard of glutathione. Thyroidoxin is evolutionarily more earlier in the cascade. It's a more primitive antioxidant peptide. And it's elevated as a consequence of oxidative stress. Importantly, though, not only is it an antioxidant, but it's a transcription factor. And it migrates to the nucleus, where it turns on an array of genes. Those genes all have to do with hypoxic responses. Specifically, in this case, hypoxia-inducible factors brands 1 and 2, which are positive for stem cell function. So HBO begets reactive oxygen species. We get a thyroidoxin response, and this is a picture based on flow cytometry of HIF1, hypoxia-inducible factor 1, in stem cells before and after an HBO exposure. And it's this elevation of HIF levels why we see improved stem cell function. The details get a bit sort of laborious, but it's found in those couple of papers. Now, so separate from the basic science, well, that's terrific. What about if you're a doctor? Can you show any of this stuff in humans? Well, you can show some of it, but it's hard to get some of the volunteers for some of the invasive studies. One of the ways we wanted to say, okay, does nitric oxide synthase become activated in humans similar to the way it does in the animals? Well, conveniently, type 3 nitric oxide synthase, eNOS, is the one in the bone marrow that gets activated that mobilizes stem cells. And it's exactly the same enzyme in our platelets that are floating around in the bloodstream. So we can conveniently draw blood and say just a simple question. If you look at nitric oxide synthase activities in platelets, do you change that as a course of HBO? So this is it's an assay for nitric oxide, which we can talk about afterwards if you're interested. Control, so a baseline level of activation. So this was a study we're getting to, which actually we're specifically looking at stem cells in diabetic patients. Before hyperbaric treatment, this is not statistically different. After the hyperbaric treatment, we see a marked elevation of nitric oxide synthase activity. Interestingly, you can do this study immediately after the hyperbaric treatment. You can put the platelets in the refrigerator, you can wait 24 hours, you can take them out and do the same assay, and you get the same result. So there's a persistent activation of the enzyme that's long after this very short interval of HBO. Now, so nitric oxide synthase goes up much the same as we've documented in mice. Do you get mobilization of stem cells? So diabetics metabolically, are very different than normal people, and there's a number of very important biochemical reasons why an HBO effect might be different. In other words, maybe you don't mobilize stem cells because you don't get the same degree of activation of nitric oxide synthase. So this was a paper that we did looking at diabetics, and now we're not, so the morphology, if you will, of the response over 20 treatments is a little different than in the last study. And that's actually because we use different markers. As time has gone by, people spend a lot of time arguing about this stuff, which I think is a waste of time. But there's different markers people use for looking at different subgroups of stem cells. And so there's a group of markers, CD34, CD133, CD31, which is a VEGF receptor, and another marker that's lower than normal. And most people think that this is the group of stem cells that are destined to become new blood vessels, sort of so-called vasculogenic stem cells. And that's what we're looking at here discretely. Control, age-matched control people before the first HBO treatment, statistically fewer circulating stem cells in diabetics. A number of groups have shown that. We're not the first. After HBO, doubling of stem cells, and we're seeing rather than persistent rise, in terms of the endothelial cells, with each treatment we see a doubling. And actually by the 20th treatment, statistically, there's many more than here. So that there is an additive effect, if you will. So there's a mobilization of stem cells in diabetics as a consequence to HBO exposure. We also are interested in those regulatory proteins in circulating cells. And so this is another measure, but we're looking here at HIF1, HIF2, and thyroidopsin. These are the regulatory proteins which we showed were critical in the mouse model. Question is, do they go up in humans? So looking at, this is as a function of a marker for stem cells. So we're looking at these proteins discretely just in the circulating stem cells. Controls before and after the first, the 10th, and the 20th hyperbaric treatments, and we see this elevation. So we're seeing increased numbers and also markedly higher levels of the regulatory proteins which are critical to improve function of the stem cells. And it's all an oxidative stress response. Now, we're talking about wound healing, so it's one thing to say we're seeing increased stem cells in the blood, but you get the stem cells to the site of action, meaning at the wound margin. And so this is tissue that is debrided from the edge of neuropathic wounds as part of standard therapy in most places. And now we're looking here at this particular slide at not just stem cell number, but we're looking at fluorescence for intracellular proteins. In the first bar, hypoxia-inducible factor brand 1 or thyroidopsin, critical enzymes for the regulation of stem cells. So this is while some patients are getting standard therapy, the wound margin at the start, and at the end of about 3 weeks, there's an elevation. But these were patients who did not clinically respond. That is to say, their wounds were deemed refractory. They were not healing. So they get referred for hyperbaric oxygen the way it happens in the United States. If you have a Wagner 3 or 4, a bad wound, limb-threatening wound, that has not gotten better in 4 weeks with aggressive, best available standard care, then those patients can go on to get hyperbaric oxygen. So this was what happened. They started hyperbaric about, 16 days on average afterwards, and they had stabilized. They looked just like they did here, but they were no better, no worse. But over the course of hyperbaric oxygen, there's a precipitous elevation again of stem cells, and also stem cells endowed with the better regulatory proteins, or the greater amount of regulatory proteins. The one big flaw in this study I'll emphasize to you is the N here. This was a pilot study to convince National Institute of Health maybe we weren't completely off our rockers, and we could do this in larger numbers of patients. And fortunately, we just started a 5-year study to hopefully get as many as 800 people enrolled to look at this sort of phenomenon. And so there's more to come on this story. All right, so in summary, I think I haven't gone out of time yet. So Rami's title, The Yin-Yang of Oxidative Stress. What I've tried to emphasize to you in sort of a rapid overview is that, yes, there's good and bad, as with everything in medicine. With hyperbaric oxygen, there's transient changes in oxidative metabolism during the oxygen exposure, which goes away because PO2 drops precipitously when someone comes out of a hyperbaric chamber or comes out of the water after breathing scuba. But there's reactive oxygen species, reactive nitrogen species that are produced, and a whole cascade of events that happen, largely, not solely, but virtually all, relatable to reactive species, which the jargon party line is, they're bad for you. And I'm going to tell you that's not true. In fact, free radicals are necessary for life. For most of the things that cells do, there has to be transient changes in reactive species. So these things can act as signaling molecules. And in the context of HBO, it's the signaling molecule responses that we're looking for in terms of therapeutic benefit. Yeah, there's toxicity, but there's transient changes very rapidly. There's changes in neutrophil responses. I showed you that data. There's also some secondary changes in other inflammatory events. And over days to weeks, really, there's changes in stem cell mobilization and stem cell function that we think is relatable to some of the therapeutic benefits. As many of you know, there's some 8 different randomized trials now that say that hyperbaric oxygen improves healing in diabetic wounds and in some radiation injuries. We would submit that that's actually not good enough. Most people say more studies need to be done. Yeah, we always like more studies. But we still need to be far smarter about how come it is that hyperbaric oxygen works. Because it well may be that we have nowhere near the optimal protocols. As many of you know, so what most places in the world are using between 30 and 40 hyperbaric treatments, often given daily, 5 or 6 or sometimes 7 days a week, at usually 2 atmospheres, some places 2.4 atmospheres. Hey, for all we know, it should be given every other day and you get a better response. Maybe you shouldn't be using hyperbaric oxygen until you've done an array of other things like debridement and a variety of other interventions. Maybe hyperbaric should only be given for a week. And you now see a detrimental effect because of some synergistic effects that we've yet to define. So my message is that until we have mechanisms, we really are not going to be fine-tuning to get the most optimal responses. So there's a lot more to the story. Ultimately, yin-yang, if you want to be positive or negative, it's all based on dose, duration, and frequency. And with that, I'm done. Ben Franklin founded Penn, which is where I work these days. So, with questions.
Thank you very much, Thom, for a very, very interesting review. We have one question, please.
Great talk, Steve. I had a question. You mentioned, the capacity for some of these chemotherapeutic drugs, or Neupogen or leukine, CGSF, CMGSF. Now, it sounded like you were saying that hyperbaric oxygen has the same capacity to at least mobilize stem cells as much as leukine or Neupogen.
Yep.
And is that mobilization of stem cells or a synthesis of new stem cells?
Well, that's all right. So first part of your question. So granulocyte monocyte colony stimulating factor, on a good day, in a so-called responding patient, as you know, there's a bell-shaped curve with everything. So some people don't respond. Some people are, quote, hyper-responders. The median amount of mobilization is about 8-fold. But it comes with huge risk, like myocardial infarction, distal thrombosis, a bunch of stuff. Those agents mobilize stem cells in part by the same pathway. There are several other pathways that are involved, though, so that although I mean, simple-minded, the numbers of stem cells are comparable with HBO. The mechanisms aren't exactly the same. Now, the other part of your question is it mobilization or is it mitosis synthesis? And you can't have one without the other. So the way stem cells work is, there's the primary stem cells that remain in the bone marrow, and they enter the cell cycle, make daughter cells that go out into the periphery. The primary stem cells, unless things go really bad, remain in the bone marrow. So mobilization is probably the wrong term, because it's not the cell merely moving out, it's the daughter cells moving out via mitosis and then peripheral response. So you get both, basically.
Okay.